how much of your life is determined by what other people believe to be true? This is probably one of the most important questions you could ask yourself if you're looking to exit the matrix. What is the matrix exactly? The matrix is not a place where your artificial intelligence is keeping dominion over bodies and using it as electricity sources, but rather the matrix is the common set of programming that 99% of the 7 billion quantum life forms on this planet live by. Ultimately, the matrix could be considered to be a set of programming that ultimately encourages you to act, think, and be like the rest. But I think if you're watching this video deep down, you know that you're not like everything else. You know that there's something more. You know that there is more behind the curtain. And so today's video, I'm going to be talking to you exactly about what the matrix is and how to get out of it. Awesome. So let's dive right in. The one thing that we really need to understand about all of reality is something that honestly has been lost for a majority of the last, I don't know, 100 to 300 years. It wasn't until Western thought started dominating our planet that humans regarded reality to be something that existed separately or objectively from themselves, right? As soon as science started to take over how we think, how we approach the world, and there's nothing wrong with science fundamentally, but ultimately what it did is it started considering objects as existing independently of us, despite not fully understanding them. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that we made as a species, was beginning to live with this separatist worldview, right? Beginning to live as though the things that we encountered were actually existing independently from ourselves. And honestly, this is what keeps most people in the matrix. If you notice, so many of the messages perpetuated by the media today are all about what you need, what you need, what you need. And this cycle of need does not start when we're adults. It actually starts when we're kids, right? What happens is that we grow up with parents whose needs weren't met, and all of a sudden our needs aren't met. And we live in a culture that capitalizes on needs not being met. And this is why the makeup is bought. This is why the trends are followed. And not every single trend objectively carries that psychological phenomena, but for most of us, we like to follow trends because we like to be accepted. We like to do what everybody else does because we think that in doing what everybody else does, we will find fulfillment. But the truth is, as soon as that wave is collapsed, the fulfillment leaves. What's so interesting about this is that many people live their entire lives going through this cycle of following the trends, following the waves, following the moves of the group, and deep down knowing that there's something more to explore, right? The school system teaches us to retain information and regurgitate it. It doesn't teach us to think for ourselves. Our jobs don't really support, at least most companies don't really support replacing the CEO while starting as a janitor, right? Most of the orientations, roles, and responsibilities in society revolve around intake of information and regurgitation of it. Now, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that, but the truth is that's a job best left for AI. I often think about what humanity might look like after we all come to this place where we understand that we're responsible for what we do, how we feel, how we act, and ultimately the outcomes that we create. And I think that what that looks like, what that humanity, what that earth looks like is simply just that, right? Humans that are conscientious of what they're intaking, of who they're listening to, right? Of who the authority that they respond to is, right? We're really mindful. We're not just taking things for granted, for a sense of objectivity. And so, and I think that's really what the matrix is. The matrix is a fundamental set of preconceptions that exist and are agreed upon by most humans. But the reality of it is that when you really dive into the psychology of the universe, you understand that meaning in and of itself is completely subjective. And when we begin to understand that meaning is subjective, I think that's one of the initial kernels that starts us barreling towards our awakening or our exit of the matrix, right? We begin to understand that things that we have determined to be true, things that we have determined to be not true, things that we may have been for, things that we may have been against, we begin to understand that so many of our own beliefs about pretty much everything is because of what somebody else told us. Now, there's nothing, again, fundamentally wrong with listening to others, right? But what really begins to happen after you begin to understand that meaning in and of itself is subjective, you begin to immediately identify how the stories that you've told yourself for so long ultimately correlate to what you've experienced. Because the truth is, most of us, if not all of us, at least in mainstream Western driven societies, are told that we need to look to something outside of ourselves to enact the change that we want. And ultimately what that does is that keeps us collectively suffering, suppressed, and those needs that we talked about earlier continue to be unmet, right? There's a new gospel that begins to unfold in us when we begin to understand that so much of what we believe isn't really objectively true. It's just what everybody else believes. We begin to understand here that I have the opportunity to tell myself new stories, because I then begin to understand that reality is a byproduct of what happens inside of me, inside of you, inside of my neighbor, right? This experience that we're having, it's a co-created experience that all of us contribute to by the nature of our fundamental self-concepts, right? What I believe to be true about myself fundamentally defines everything in my world. It defines how I interact. It defines how I see myself. It defines how I see others. It defines how I react to others. It defines how I engage with others. It literally defines everything. Our fundamental self-concept keeps us organized, keeps the ego organized, and everything after that concept seeks to confirm itself, right? And so what happens here is that you have a society that's bent on telling you that, A, you don't have what you need, and you need all these different things, when the reality is you don't. You just need silence. You just need reflection. You just need mindfulness, because the truth is you are as powerful as you could ever want to be right now, because power does not come from force. It comes from consciousness. Right? And I know we get a little deep there, and we'll dive into that here in a little bit, right? But the first thing we're talking about in exiting the matrix is understanding that meaning is completely, in and of itself, subjective in nature, and that you have no obligation to define something or assign meaning in a way that somebody else does. And here's the interesting thing about meaning. I think one of the reasons it runs so deep and our traditions are so deep is because for most of us, our traditions define who we are. They define our culture, they define where we come from. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think it's interesting to note that meaning changing in many cases, right, at least in my experience working with clients, meaning implies a sense of security being imposed on. It implies, the chance that something might not be what it means my security is dwindling. And this is an amazing thing. So if you're going through this process in the beginning, you're going through what we would call the dark night of the soul. This is an amazing opportunity for you, because ultimately what happens here is that as you begin to really find that you've found so much of your security in things that you've believed to be true, and traditions and all these different things, you get the opportunity to discover a security that goes beyond physical boundaries, right? You begin to discover a sense of worth, a sense of identity, a sense of beingness that exists outside of what everybody else has deemed to be true. There's something so sacred about the silence from mind chatter, not just from external chatter, but from the mind chatter as well, and getting an opportunity to be able to sit with myself and understand that meaning is subjective, and then dive into the implications of how ultimately my belief in the objectivity of the meaning I've assigned has driven my life, right? This is a natural progression. I see this in virtually everybody that begins to go down this line, right? So first you begin to understand that, hey, things are not necessarily what they seem, because at the end of the day, what we're really doing is agreeing to collective meaning. I think Terence McKenna calls culture a collective hallucination, right? We're collectively agreeing that things mean a certain thing when the reality is they don't, because meaning literally in and of itself is completely subjective. And so after we begin to realize that there is an identity that exists beyond meaning, we begin to really, I think, and I've observed, have an opportunity to look at our lives in more of an objective viewpoint than we ever have. We really begin to look at, okay, what have I been doing? Who have I been entertaining? What have I been believing about myself? How have I been acting that has ultimately contributed to me getting to where I don't want to go, right? And then I'm able to really look back and say, okay, well, I can see how these friend groups ultimately, right? What does Jim Rohn say, the marketer, speaker, right? He says you're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with the most. It's true, right? That's exactly how humans work. So I can see how my group of friends ultimately led me to this circle. I can see how my choices here led me here, right? Really just taking a full inventory and personal responsibility when it comes to how my life is unfolding. Because the truth is, I can't control what happens around me, but I can control what happens inside of me, right? I can't control what happens around me. I can control what happens inside of me. And if I can control what happens inside of me, I can handle anything outside of me, right? So I begin to understand as well, that when I refer to that inner outer dichotomy, that there's a connection. There's a connection between the world inside, or the events that go on in my body, the emotional events, the reactional events, right? The events that go on in my body, and how I interface and interact with other people. I think this is one of the most illuminating things that happens on our journey, because then we begin to understand, okay, so I've assigned all of this meaning and all of these layers, which is completely subjective. I've believed all of these stories, which ultimately have no objectivity in and of themselves, in the sense that the story and the belief can be shifted at any given moment, okay? And now I'm beginning to take inventory of everything that's going on here, everything that I'm doing, how I'm contributing to the quality of my reality. And this is where you begin to gain confidence, because then you start, really, if you find the right people, you begin to start looking at new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of being. You begin to start appreciating yourself more and walking from a place of fullness, as opposed to walking around looking for everything that you need, right? You begin to walk around from a place of fundamental satisfaction, regardless of what's going on, because your satisfaction and your fulfillment in life is not tied to something you're doing. It's tied to something that's deeper than anything that could ever be done. And what is amazing about that paradox is, when my satisfaction exists independently of everything around me, I'm all of a sudden streaming at the speed of light towards the very thing that I am actually the most fulfilled with outside of me, right? It is all an internal game. And the truth is, until our internal game is where we want our external game to be, the external game will never be there, because how we are inside is how we are outside, as above, so below, as within, so without, because the same being is experiencing itself in all forms of matter, albeit subjectively, right? So a couple things, right? We've talked about leaving the matrix. It starts with ultimately understanding meaning being fundamentally subjective. Then we've started to talk about taking inventory. We've talked about what really begins to happen as you begin to understand all of the things that you've told yourself, and the subjectivity of everything that you've told yourself, right? Now what we really want to do is we want to get proactive, right? When we're leaving the matrix, or when we're leaving everybody's ideas of what is, and creating a reality for ourselves that is ultimately what we want, I have to become committed to myself. And when I talk about being committed to myself, I'm not just talking about committed to one portion of myself. I have to become committed to all aspects of myself, which means I have to become committed to understanding the states of consciousness that I'm in and out of throughout the day, right? Because if what I see is a byproduct of who I am, right? We don't attract what we want, we attract what we are. If what I see is a byproduct of who I am, then ultimately, the more I affect what's going on inside of me, and I raise my spirit, my consciousness, my vibration, whatever words you want to use there, right? I generate that satisfaction, that happiness, that joy, that peace. All of a sudden, I begin to experience more and more of that in the world around me. What happens here is, as I begin to let go of those limiting stories that I've told for so long, and I begin to move more into a state of fulfillment, into conscious states of joy and fulfillment, of being happy with myself just because, not needing a bunch of other things to make me happy. As I begin to get into there, my life begins to work itself out. And this is where the balance between masculine and feminine energy in our lives comes from, right? There's amazing things that can be done with taking action, especially if that action is inspired. There are equally amazing things that can be done by surrendering to the process, because the truth is, this is not an overnight process. This will most likely be going on for the rest of your life. And so I want to get comfortable with the process. I want to get comfortable being happy with where I am, because the truth is, if I'm not happy with where I am now, I'm not going to be happy with where I am 10 years down the line. If I am, that happiness is going to go away, because my fundamental state is non-happiness. So really, a lot of this, after you get through the dark night of the soul and really moving away from the collective matrix of thinking and programming, you really begin to find your own groove and your own flow. And this is what you've wanted all along. You've wanted to live in your purpose. You've wanted to live in fulfillment. You've wanted to live in peace. You've wanted to live in abundance. And all of these things They come after you begin discovering who you are. But until that process of meaning deconstruction, of the dark night of the soul, right, of losing all sense of security in physical, tangible objects, and moving through that and shaping, like Michelangelo, a new identity for myself, only then will I experience the fruit of that identity. Because you can look at your state of consciousness as ultimately a seed, right? And what you water, what you intentionally enter into throughout the day is ultimately the water that you're watering that seed with. And you water that seed, ultimately it becomes a tree. And an apple tree produces apples. It does not produce oranges. And so as I begin to carry this discipline of self-influence, of self-agency, of taking total responsibility for my states of consciousness, how I'm reacting, I give myself the biggest leg up in life, because now I am beginning to take full ownership of everything, right? And I'm tapping into something that's greater than myself. And what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks is talking about what that greater self is. But here's the thing, right? If you're looking to get out of the matrix, the first thing that you can do is start simply looking at how many of the stories you've told yourself that other people have believed to be true about themselves. I can't tell you how many stories I allowed to be true for me just because they were what people of influence told me when I was younger. And it's no judgment towards them. They were only telling me what they knew to tell me. But what I know now is that I have no obligation to get with anything that anybody else says to me, right? I do have an obligation, though, to become so secure in and of myself that nothing around me can move me to such a degree that I'm able to navigate situations successfully and creating higher and higher and higher levels of thriving for myself, for my family, and for everybody around me. So you take this process, you run with it, you're going to find yourself in ups and downs and ebbs and flows. And the most important thing you can do is focus on your center, focus on yourself, because at the end of the day, nothing else really matters. It really doesn't. There is no amount of focusing on things other than yourself that is ever going to justify not focusing on yourself. Okay. So this is the first step in leaving the matrix. And as I mentioned, this is really going to be a lifetime journey for you. But guess what? You've got somebody that's on your bench. You've got some support. And that's what this is all about. We're a community. We're a movement of people that are wandering through some pretty deep waters together, and know that when you're with us, you have that family. So thank you for checking this video out today. I really hope that you got some really tangible points from it. If you want some clarification, go ahead and share in the comments. Go ahead and share anywhere you want. You can email us, but we love seeing you. If you like what you heard today, go ahead and press that red subscribe button. Press the notification so that the next time we upload a video, you'll know exactly when, and you can get that content before anybody else. But you're loved, you're amazing, you're powerful, you're wonderful, and we'll talk to you soon.